and it's saved in our archives. Uh, just want to mention the webinar that you're attending today. So we are going to be talking about the implications of corporate residential ownership and having a just really a conversation with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy team here. And part of that is really talking about the topic here, which is about corporate investors, how they're playing an increasingly influential role in the United States residential real estate market. Their actions have drawn national and local attention, prompting legislative debate and a focus on the need for additional research across the country. And the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy has helped to guide this research through its Center for Geospatial Solutions. And so we're going to be talking and having a conversation about those findings, which consisted of an analysis of residential property ownership in nearly 500 urban counties across the country, and then examining how those patterns of land ownership are evolving. So if you signed up for that, you're at the right webinar in our community impact briefing today. And I would like to take this opportunity now to formally introduce our friends here from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I practiced that so many times. It didn't come out. First off, we've got Dr. George W. or Mac McCarthy is the president and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Since arriving at the Lincoln Institute in 2014, he has grown the organization from 38 to 165 full-time employees. His work to expand the organization's relevance and impact is evidenced by numerous achievements, including establishing a partnership with Claremont Lincoln University, developing state-of-the-art technology that tells parcel-level stories of land use with unprecedented detail, and growing the Lincoln Institute's presence on a global scale through its work in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Along with Mac, we also have Robert J. or RJ McGrail with us, Director of Accelerating Community Investment, and he's the principal investigator there. He brings new partners to the community investment system, and the project seeks to increase the efficacy and benefits of philanthropic impact investing portfolios and their connectivity to local community investment ecosystems through a combination of field research and convening leaders in the community investment system, with particular focus on housing, economic development, finance authorities, development of potential investment opportunities for mission investors, as well as the collaboration with other Lincoln program areas. We also have with us Reina Chano Murray. Reina is the Associate Director at the Center for Geospatial Solutions. Reina brings a decade of experience in administering geospatial systems, as well as a background in workflow automation, urban planning, and cultural heritage management. At the center, she manages client relationships, oversees projects, and contributes to business and technology development. And for the sake of our 60-minute webinar today, they have such wonderful biographies. I would encourage you to go to the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to see their full backgrounds. But with that, thank you all for being here. We are just excited to have this conversation. Timely one. There's so much happening right now around this very topic, especially what's coming out of the White House and HUD. And so with that, I do want to pass it over to RJ. Thanks, RJ.
Thanks, Raquel. We're excited to be here. The Trust has been a longtime partner of the Institute. We got to know you and Chris and the team and Christopher Tyson as well. We want to thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Who Owns America and to share some of this analysis and solutions with the Trust's members and stakeholders. I think we're going to start off with a little bit of background on the data analysis that led to the report. A very catchy, good branding name of Who Owns America. We've been at this for a bit, and I'm going to ask Reina to start us off and just very simply ask, Reina, what is Who Owns America?
Sure. Thanks, RJ. So thank you all again for attending. We're really excited to be here today, and I am happy to talk more about what Who Owns America, or WOA, as we like to call it here at CGS, is. So Who Owns America started Who Owns America is essentially an effort to uncover property ownership patterns with unprecedented ease, precision, and nuance. And It really came about because we were seeing a lot of headlines like these. I'm sure you're familiar with similar headlines, if not the same ones. And we noted that there's a lot of data out there, but it's often very hard to access. And also the data format is often it's often quite raw. So while there are ways to get information, it's not very easy to do. Um, Here at the Lincoln Institute, we see our role as being as providing tools to help local governments. And in the context of WOE, we especially see this in terms of providing tools that help local governments or other partners identify ownership changes and patterns, think about how to strategically use different types of land, and promote strategic data-driven decision making. So with Who Owns America, we saw that there was a lot of existing data and information out there regarding parcels, regarding land ownership, but it was not standardized and it was not easily available and accessible in a uniform format. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the experience of going to, say, a tax assessor's parcel viewer site and putting in an address and clicking through on a particular parcel. Um, and that is a very useful tool that allows you to view information for a single parcel one at a time. And if you have a particular question for that one parcel, that suffices. But if your question is more broad, so for example, you want to understand how many parcels or what types of owners may be most vulnerable to some of those headlines that I just showed, like the We Buy Ugly Homes crowd, or how many parcels in my neighborhood are already owned by corporate entities or companies. That can be really hard to answer if you're sort of stuck using a parcel viewer that only allows you to look one parcel at a time. And that's where WOE, or Who Owns America, comes in. It's designed to be a standardized research and query ready parcel data set. What I mean by that is that we have designed this to be consistent, to be a consistent and scalable way to understand who owns what. And we use this to try to answer and explore questions around land ownership. We have a robust parcel ownership analysis, and our ownership categories create what we like to call a common language around vast localities. We are able to better understand whether or not a parcel is publicly owned, whether it is owned by a private corporation or company, or if it is an individual owner, and if that particular owner is living in that property, making it an owner-occupied home. Um, we try to have, and we do this, we do this, we place a lot of emphasis on creating the standardized data set so that we can do apples to apples comparison. We can compare different locations across the country at different scales as well. We can look at a neighborhood using the same standardized metrics that we then can apply to, say, a county or to the greater state as well. Additionally, with Who Owns America, we're able to better understand a parcel's relationships to other parcels. So, because we standardize and clean owner information, we are able to understand how many parcels may share the same mailing address. So what maybe looks like a single owner in your particular neighborhood may in fact be a large out-of-state entity that owns 65 other properties across the country, or 65,000 other properties across the country. Um, and so with this parcel data set, we support decision making in four key ways. To provide that contextualization, so who owns what, this baseline understanding just to help identify trends and patterns. We use WOE to do scenario planning. So what happens if we enact X policy? We can basically model potential effects before decisions are made. We can use it to do optimal site selection. So with the information that we've added to our parcels, in addition to all the cleaning and standardizing we have done, we can ask questions like, where are the best locations for housing, infrastructure, or conservation? And last, for monitoring, this is a national parcel data set that we are creating and uh, twice a year. Excuse me, once a year right now, but we're moving towards twice a year. What that allows us to do is have what I like to call snapshots in time of ownership. And so moving forward, as now that we've created this baseline, we are better able to understand how the land is changing in terms of ownership patterns, and it enables long-term tracing and tracking. So for planners and policymakers, this means data-driven housing solutions and strategies. For researchers, it means a clearer picture of how land ownership shapes communities. And for community organizations, it means hard evidence uncovering hidden ownership. And it looks like RJ might be struggling to unmute.
Oh,
I
Sorry about that.
There you
Um,
go.
I so the tool has a robust set of outputs and outcomes and possibilities that I think we're going to get to in a second. But one of the things that I think is an important piece of the story is why this is happening. What are the underlying economics? What are the underlying land economics? What are the underlying conditions in place that are causing this, the pattern that the report reference, the uptick in these acquisitions of portfolios, et cetera. And I'd love it, Mac, if you could kind of walk us through that piece of the story. Woe tells us what's happening and tells us what happens when we do something about it. But I'd love to I'd love to hear a little bit more about the economics that underlie the choices that institutional and investment capital is making to purchase up these assets in communities all over the country.
sure, sure. Thanks. So, this is a story that's certainly not lost on NCST because, frankly, the economics of the single-family housing market it turned upside down during the Great Financial Crisis, and we know that it really created all sorts of anguish in terms of the loss of housing by people through foreclosure. But what it also did was it offered a real opportunity for investors to kind of get control of a very large share of the housing market very, very inexpensively, right? And so if you don't know, I mean, one of the things that Blackstone, one of the biggest investors in the single family market now, was doing during the great financial crisis around 2010 to 2012 is they were buying up gigantic inventories of non-performing loans, like 10,000 at a time, right? And basically their model was to get control of the homes, find a way to kind of whatever clear title as quickly as they could. Sometimes they would just rent the homes back to the original homeowners, and then they were waiting for the housing market to recover so they could just flip the homes back into the market. And I reviewed a bunch of those portfolios when they were doing it because I was working in this space when I was with the Ford Foundation, and they were looking at ROIs that would run between 30 and 50% on those transactions. Now, as it turns out, they were a little bit overly optimistic about how the housing market was going to recover. And what they ended up with was tens of thousands of housing units in inventories and billions of dollars of money out there that they used to purchase the mortgages and no cash flow back. And so they needed to figure out what they could do with that. So they decided that they were going to try to find a way to generate enough cash flow, at least to keep their investors happy. And so they set up a property management company called Invitation Homes. Now, if you don't know Invitation Homes, it's the largest owner of single-family homes in the United States today. Around 100,000 homes that it has in its inventory. And what Invitation Homes did for the rest of the field was it cracked the code on how to do scattered site single-family property management. One of the reasons we didn't have lots of large-scale institutional investors in the single-family market before that was because nobody thought it made sense to try to manage scattered sites because it seemed to be uneconomical. But using technology and using just good business smarts, Invitation Homes figured out that all they needed to do was standardize all the components inside the homes, like countertops and appliances and flooring. And then as those things broke or wore out or whatever else, they would just go and they would replace things. And they wouldn't even bother to fix anything that broke. Like, if a faucet was dripping, they would replace the whole sink. So but the idea was that they would then make it possible for them to just really actually have all the components they would need kind of roaming around the country in trucks with SKUs on them ready to go when anything happened. And so their large volume of homes that they owned were easily managed, especially because they were heavily concentrated geographically. The majority of the first, 50,000 homes that Invitation Homes bought were in the what they called the sand states, Nevada, Arizona, Florida. And so they're able to kind of make those economics work. And then little by little, other people figured it out as well. So the economics became even more profoundly favorable to moving housing from owner occupancy to rental during COVID, because what happened was we had rents going up substantially, typically at double-digit rates, and people without the wherewithal to be able to buy homes, even though interest rates were low, right? And so little by little, what they figured out was if they could buy a home and rent it, they could find a way to economically kind of manage the property. The numbers actually made sense, not just to buy homes and fix them and flip them, but to buy homes and hold them long term to cash flow. And so the easy economics to think about this, and this is the slide I have here, is that for every $500 of net monthly rental income you get from a property, that will capitalize to a property value of about $100,000, right? And that's using a cap rate of 6%, which is actually a very high cap rate for the rental markets now, because a lot of rental markets are getting closer to 4% in terms of cap rates. And if you don't know what cap rates are, you're going to have to look it up. So anyway, so this example, a 3-bedroom home that rents for $2,000 a month and produces $1,500 a month in net income is worth $300,000. Now, a 3-bedroom home for $300,000 might seem like kind of a rare, circumstance, but it actually isn't. And that's the other part of the story, which is even though Blackstone and Invitation Homes decided to go to what they consider to be more robust markets in the Sand States, as it turns out, the real investment opportunities are not in the Sand States. They're in any of the places in which rents are high and acquisition prices are low. And where do you think that is? Well, as it turns out, and what you'll see in the report that Reina referenced, is that it's in low and moderate income neighborhoods and typically in older industrial cities. So all the older industrial cities that thought that they were, on the last gasp during the great financial crisis with Detroit going into bankruptcy and all that, they were actually just positioning themselves to be now kind of ready for an invasion of institutional capital buying up their housing stock. And if you look at that report and you look at St. Louis or you look at Baltimore, you'll see that in some neighborhoods, upwards of 50% of the single family stock is now owned by investors because they see these economics working out. So Reina, if you go to the next slide, one of the things you'll see is, and I put this slide in, and this is really, there's a lot going on in this slide, and I really think you should kind of take a look at it, but this is how investors think. And I got this from an investor sheet from private equity folks, right? And they ranked all the best markets for buying single family rentals. And as you see, look at the best markets in terms of cash flow and the balanced markets: Cleveland, Birmingham, Dayton, Memphis, Allentown, Pennsylvania. These markets are all older industrial cities: South Bend, St. Louis. These are the places where you never would have expected to see lots of housing investment going on. But the reason is, and if you go across the different columns, you'll see, number one is the price to rent ratio, right? If the acquisition price is low and the rents are high, then the ratio is going to be low, and that's where you want to buy, right? And then they actually break it down, but they also look at other things like how high are the property taxes? What's the state income tax? What's the capital gains tax in the state? And if you look all the way over to the right, you'll also notice that they look at things like the quality of tenant laws or flood risk or other kinds of risk, right? So they've kind of put all this together to figure out where they're going to spend their money. And lo and behold, they're spending the money in places, as it turns out, where our report kind of showed, yeah, that's where they're going, right? So I did a little thought experiment, and then I just checked it out myself last summer. And if you go to the next slide, Reina, I just went to some of the best markets in the country, right? And these are based on like FHFA market for 2024. Akron, Ohio is the number 10 market, right? And I said, what is the median house price in that market? And this is a median house price for, the general median house price in the market as reported by HUD, the median rent for a 3-bedroom apartment. And then I asked, if you capitalized the net rent revenue that you would get from that median rent, what would it capitalize to in terms of a value that, what should the house cost, right? And you see the capitalized value for that median rent, if you assume a 15% management fee, is $236,100. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because the capitalized value is higher than the median house price in that market. which means there's a hell of a lot of houses available in that market that an investor could buy, where they know they're already cash flow, and in the future the cash flow is going to be even better if rents keep going up at high single digits or double digit rates, right? So the day that I did this, I went to Zillow and I just asked Zillow how many 3+ bedroom single family homes were for sale in Akron, Ohio. And on that day, there were 284 of them, right? So there's plenty of investment opportunity in Akron. And I'm not telling you this so you can go out and start investing. I'm just telling you this because this is explaining what's going on. And once we understand what's going on, that can give us a little bit of an insight as to how we might prevent all of our single family housing stock from slipping out of our control. So, Reina, if you just go to the next slide, I'm going to just go through a couple more cities really quickly. Kingston, New York was a #1 housing market for 2 solid years during COVID. The median house price in Kingston was $359. The median rent for a 3-bedroom apartment was about $2,355, right? And that capitalized to a $400,000 valuation, right? As it turns out, the day I went to look in Kingston, and Kingston's only got 35,000 people, right? The number of 3+ bedroom single family homes for sale in that market that day was 67. So once again, lots of opportunity, even in a tiny little place like Kingston, New York. If you don't know where it is, it's on the Hudson River, about 90 miles north of New York City. So if you go to the next one, Reina. So Buffalo, another similar story. In Buffalo, as it turns out, the capitalized value is about the same as the median house price for a 3-bedroom apartment. But as it turns out, there were 551 units, houses available on the market the day that I looked at it, right? And if you go to the next one, Reina, because this is just one that's, as it turns out, in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which was the #1 housing market by the FHFA in 2024, the median house price was slightly higher than the capitalized value of the rent revenue for a 3-bedroom apartment. But there were still 224 homes available in the market that day when I looked at it on Zillow, ready to be swept up by investors. So, all right. Next slide. I think might be where I stop, right? I'm going to just tell you. So one of the things we can do, and one of the great things that RJ and I can report on, is there are people that are actively out there trying to figure out what to do in their own markets because they've been watching this thing unfold, right? But one of the things we can do is try to get a share of the housing market out of the speculative market, and we do that by actually finding ways to put them into permanent affordability, like community land trusts, or acquire them and sell them with deed restrictions from the public sector, or even restrict them temporarily, right? But the biggest thing we want to do is change the economics through policy, tax and otherwise, and we want to build more housing on public land. So I'm going to stop there, and RJ, you can take us where you want to go. Next stop.
Before we jump into a little bit more about what we're learning from the Who Owns America tool and the report, I was struck by the comparison between an Akron and an Allentown, where there's more capitalized value in Allentown and there's slightly as compared to median, but in both cases, several hundred homes available for purchase. Do you have any thoughts, Mac, on kind of what that distribution means when, is a place where the values are not exactly lined up more or less attractive to investors? Have we thought through that?
Yeah, so I looked at about 200 cities, RJ, and I looked at, high cost cities too, like LA and Seattle and Miami. And even in those markets, there were a decent number of homes that were available on the market, 3-bedroom plus homes on the market that would generate a cash flow that would warrant their purchase, even though the median house price was well above the cash flow value you would estimate from a 3-bedroom apartment, right? So there are going to be neighborhoods in Miami or neighborhoods in LA or neighborhoods in any of these high cost cities that are going to attract investment, but not like a whole city, like a Baltimore or a Buffalo or an Allentown, right? Because those whole cities are relatively inexpensive, and the housing stock is much more uniform, right? And so that's why you're going to see that investment going in. And you got to remember that one of the economics, lessons that we've learned from trying to do scattered site property management is it does make sense for investors to concentrate their purchases because having the properties in close proximity makes them easier to manage, right?
Right.
And so that's that. So if, and one of the things you'll see if Reina shows the maps in like St. Louis or in Baltimore, that concentration is profound. I mean, you don't even have to do any kind of high level analysis to figure that out. You just look at the maps and go, holy crap, right? And so maybe Reina, you want to just tell us what holy crap means in this regard in these maps of St. Louis and Baltimore.
Sure. So holy crap in this context means that, and actually let me give it a little bit of context. So with these two maps are from the report that we published that was referenced at the beginning of this talk. And in the report, we were analyzing residential parcel ownership in nearly 500 urban counties. And what we showed was that the corporations now own about 8.9% of residential parcels in these 500 urban counties across the U.S. That's the mean, the average. And there are, though, a lot of counties where and cities where that concentration is much higher, and St. Louis and Baltimore top that list. St. Louis is the highest on our list with 20.9% corporate owned. 17.6% of that is in-state corporate owned ownership, and 3.3% is out of state. Baltimore is the second highest with 19.6% corporate owned, 15.8% in-state, 3.8% out of state. And as you can see from these two maps, these, and from what Mac was just saying, these parcels are not randomly dispersed. If you have a corporate owner in your city or your neighborhood, they tend to be concentrated together, and they're more likely. We were able to show statistically that that they tend to be concentrated in lower income, as well as also majority non-white neighborhoods, and you really see that in a stark way in both St. Louis and Baltimore. I will show the Baltimore close-up map here. This is near Patterson Park, just north of it. This is a part of Baltimore where you can kind of see a bit of a dividing line here, where underneath Fayette Street, you tend to have more parcels that are gray, which means these are residential parcels that are not corporate owned, owner occupied homes, etc. And then if you look north of Fayette Street, you suddenly see that it is hard to come across a single block that isn't that where a good concentration of those parcels are not corporate owned. And the dark red is for in-state corporate, and the pink is for out-of-state corporate ownership.
Thanks, Reina. So the report identified the spatial concentration. We've talked a little bit about the economic and property management reasons for that. One of the things I think was interesting in the report as well is that when you layer over some of those demographic considerations that Reina was just mentioning, that these neighborhoods are concentrated and targeted for a bunch of the reasons on the why investors choose where they choose slide that Mac shared a little bit earlier. And we started to talk about this, and I'd love to close this out with a little bit more discussion about Who Owns America as a robust set of tools. This analysis in the corporate ownership report showed the concentration, showed the increasing pattern of acquisition over time. And we started to talk about this a little bit, and I'd love to kind of close this out by saying, what does all this mean in terms of solutions for communities? And I'll turn to both Mac and Reina, but we'll probably start with Mac on this one, to talk through some of the land use and zoning choices, the tax policy choices, and then I think ultimately you also need to build more homes. We could talk a little bit about where and how we pay to do that in communities all across the country.
So Reina, if you go to the next slide. So I have a list, and I don't know how many I have for you today, but I think we have a list of about 16 to 18 different policy and regulatory responses that local or state governments could make to kind of impede the invasion of capital into neighborhoods. But one of the first things that we've noticed is, and this just baffles me why this is, but a very small share of places actually maintains an active rental registry. And all that means is if someone's proposing to rent a house, you have them kind of register with the city that they're going to be renting the house. And what we also like is a nice vacant property registry. This is something that was advocated by NCST back in 2010, I think. But anyway, the idea would be just to know what's going on, right? And then you can track what's going on. Even more than that, if you have a good rental registry, you know what people are charging for rent, and you also have the opportunity to inspect every once in a while to make sure that that nobody's coming to harm in low quality rentals by whatever bottom feeder investors, right? So it's really distressing how few places actually have and maintain a rental registry. But this is like number one on our list as the first public policy response, right? Another is, and this is the most aggressive one, is to enforce and implement a right of first refusal. And one of the things that we've been advocating is for any home that has $1 of public subsidy, put a right of first refusal on it as a condition of the public subsidy, and then at least the city gets a look at the home before it trades hands, right? The other thing is, of course, curtailing short-term rentals, or at least kind of getting a handle on the short-term rentals, not just with the rental registry, but with inspections or with different tax rates for short-term rentals. They should be getting charged the same taxes we charge hotels, right? Finally, aggressive code enforcement, standard setting like state rent stabilization. And after we did a presentation of this in New York, just about a month later, Governor Hochul actually proposed a 75-day exclusion period to give home buyers a fair shot ahead of investors. And one of the reasons for that is that last year, a third of all the transactions in the single-family market were cash only. And I don't know how many first-time home buyers are buying homes with cash only, but I would say it's pretty close to zero, right? And so the idea was to level the playing field, right? So that home buyers can find a way to get their financing in place and stuff when they're bidding for a home. Now, I'm not quite sure how you enforce this, but anyway, it's at least the spirit of the policy is a good thing, right? Let's just try to, slow down the flow of capital into the neighborhoods and figure out a way for people who want to buy a home and need to buy a home that we're going to have an opportunity. If you go to the next one, Reina. So the other ones are just some direct market interventions, and one of them is one of my favorites is an ACI member, the Port of Cincinnati, who just decided, oh, screw it. We're just going to go out and we're going to outbid the investors and buy the homes ourselves. And they bought an inventory of 194 homes in their first acquisition as part of this Care Homes initiative that they're now stabilizing and they're putting back on the market either as high quality rental or eventually kind of transitioning them back into low mod home ownership opportunities. But they're doing that as a way to save their neighborhoods. Because one of the things the port was getting was complaints from people in the neighborhoods that these outside investors are coming in and they're doing silly things like stripping out all the landscaping to reduce the cost of maintaining the homes, right? And they said that they were just destroying their neighborhoods, right? And of course, I mentioned scaling up permanent affordability, and the best way to scale up permanent affordability is to find ways to dedicate public land to build and scale up community land trust, because that's the best long-term affordable housing that we have out there. If you want to go to the next slide, Reina. And then there's tax solutions, right? You can have property tax escalators for vacant properties and differential property tax rates. I proposed this in a lot of places and people were shocked to think that this could even be possible. But I said, why don't we just make a local rule that says if you own more than 10 rental units in a market, you're no longer a residential owner, you're a commercial owner, and let's just start charging you commercial property tax rates. And most people scratch their heads and go, I wonder if that's legal. I go, well, if it isn't legal, change the rules, make it legal, right? You reassess the property value of rental properties, and you assess the property value based on the cash flow, the capitalized cash flow, instead of the comp price in the market if the comp prices are too low, right? Once again, people scratch their heads. They didn't know that this is possible, but as it turns out, there actually are 3 legitimate ways that you can actually do assessments, right? Only one of them is with comps. One of them is with cash flow, and the other is kind of the cost of new construction, right? Stop selling tax liens. I just hate selling tax liens. I just put that in there. And then there's some of the federal rules, like the state and local tax limits that were imposed in the first Trump administration. That has a real dimming effect on people to be owner occupants, while all the state and local taxes that are paid by investors are written off because they're the cost of doing business. But they put limitations on what homeowners can take on their state and local tax limits, right? And also in terms of their interest, mortgage interest deductions, even though the mortgage interest deduction isn't my favorite policy, mortgage interest, if you limit how much people can deduct the mortgage interest if they own the property, why don't you limit how much they can take for mortgage interest deductions if you rent the property? That's all written off in terms of, once again, operating costs, right? And then, of course, impose a heavy land value increment tax, and we can talk about what that is if anybody is interested, on short-term owners who flip the properties. But we leave that for now. But anyway, I mean, there's lots of these things, but the most important thing is to recognize that the market dynamics are the things that are leading to this is just the most recent manifestation of what happens when a market gets wacky, right? And the wackiness of these housing markets is a result of underproduction that we've been going through for at least 25 years. In the last 25 years, we've been producing homes at rates that are sometimes almost a half of the peak rates that we're doing in the 1960s and 1970s, right? And so we got to build more. And if we're going to build more, the question is where and how. And of course, our answer is do it on public land. Find a way to identify public land so that the public sector can have control of what gets built, can decide what gets built, and can have eyes on what gets built forever if they convey the land in the right way, meaning by lease. And so I think one of the things that maybe RJ you want to talk quickly about is the ACI, the Accelerated Community Investment Community of Practice, that as I mentioned, this Port of Cincinnati is a member, but we have members all over the country, and a lot of them, I'd say the vast majority of them, are seeking innovative ways to finance new housing construction. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would. Thanks, Mac. Those are market solutions. I mean, the port didn't go chase the state of Ohio for grant dollars to buy that portfolio. The port is a bond issuer, and the port went to market and got $16.5 million in cash, and as Mac pointed out, built a securities instrument, built a special purpose bond issuance, went and did outbid other investor owners to purchase the in their jurisdiction portion of a larger portfolio of homes. Reina, could we go to the one more? Yeah, one more. So perfect. Yeah. So in our Accelerating Community Investment Initiative, we're fully committed to taking both that public lands lens and the corporate ownership lens and using those insights in this 18-state network around the country, figuring out ways to leverage the tool, figuring out ways to build cross-sector alignment, to build the capacity and learning network. ACI is at its core a learning network of public finance practitioners, investors, and community partners all around the country. And then to figure out ways to design those instruments, to design new tax policy, to design new regulatory structures. And most importantly, next slide. Back one, sorry. To think about designing strategies that are local. Next one. One more. Examples of some of the products that we think would be interesting. You can any municipality, any county, any special purpose in debt issuing authority of one form or another has the ability to access private activity volume cap. This is the tax code's project finance tool. It is in many markets oversubscribed, but in an equal number of markets, it remains undersubscribed as a tool. So you could use a bond structure or a pooled capital structure to build a targeted acquisition fund. You could think about leveraging public finance tools. You could think about using the data in a tool like Who Owns America to think about your own target areas. Back one, sorry. To think about your own target areas. If investors are being sophisticated, Who Owns America can help communities and stakeholders be similarly sophisticated about where to buy, what to buy, how to pay for build, and where to build. And then to think about impact investment and catalytic capital as a lever. These are patient, mission-aligned investors who are actively seeking in markets all over the country, both fixed income debt and equity opportunities to invest their capital. They can be participants. They can be what we call the grease and glue capital that can unlock these at scale market tools in public finance markets and others that can get communities out of the let's go chase a grant to do a project cycle. That's noble work, but it doesn't get to hundreds of homes or thousands of investor owned homes or hundreds of thousands of families who don't have the opportunity to access home ownership and the economic stability, family stability, and other outcomes that come from better home ownership. I know that that's something that everybody on an NCST call cares deeply about. So I think in closing, we stand ready with the tool, with advice about the policy solutions, and from the ACI perspective, with targeted deep engagement with places over the time that it takes to blend catalytic capital and market tools like public finance and others to help places realize the opportunity, get the capital they need at the scale to make a real dent and provide real opportunity for home ownership for more families all across the country. So I think with that, we'll close, and I know we have a little bit of time for some questions. So I guess we'll go back to Raquel.
Thanks. Thank you all. Great presentation. And we do have some questions here. I know Chris is lining up for us. If we can just dive into those, that would be perfect at this time.
Yes, a great deal of interest in this topic. And of course, you guys covered it. It was so robust, and really appreciate you taking us, through the origins of the housing foreclosure crisis in order to more fully understand what brought us here, providing the visual understanding with the mapping and certainly your recommended solutions. Right out of the gate, there was a question just with respect to terminology. Reina, if I can turn this to you, can you talk more about how corporate was defined in this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So corporate here refers to really any formalized structure. So, for example, if a landlord has taken the step to formalize his or her their rental properties under an LLC or a grouping of LLCs, corporate also refers to any businesses or companies as well as corporations. But we basically do in our data set is we have a list of key terms that we look for that would indicate some sort of a formalized corporate structure. And that is what we use.
That's really helpful. And also appreciated you were able to break down the two examples you shared there in St. Louis and Baltimore, kind of that distinction between someone in and out of state or an entity in or out of state as well. Really very helpful. Mac, you talked about advocacy around this idea of a vacant property registry. And there's an interesting take on that. The question is, are there ways that you've seen for a vacant property registry that wouldn't be taken advantage of by corporate buyers? While it creates transparency for good actors, it's probably be primarily utilized by bad actors, is a suggestion from the questioner.
Well, I mean, there's many ways you can act badly as an investor, but the problem is if you don't have eyes on vacant properties, and one of the things is, not all these investor properties that people buy are actually rented. A lot of them are held vacant, right? And one of the really perplexing things that always kills me, if you actually look up the value chain in most rental markets, the higher you get in the value chain, the higher the vacancy rate is, which just makes no sense at all, except for the fact that lots of people are using U.S. real estate as a way to launder money, right? And so these $100 million apartments in these, pencil-thin towers in New York City that are vacant every night, right? Those that's just a misuse of everything that you could possibly imagine, including the permission to build, right? Because they're taking resources out of the space to build those things, and then they sit vacant. It's just like, it just makes me nuts, right? So and if you don't know what's vacant, then you can't do anything to kind of get ahead of it or to find ways to build the right incentives to keep people from leaving them vacant, right? So in places like Washington, D.C., they said vacant properties, whether they're vacant land or vacant units, they can build escalators on the property tax rate to make people find ways to use them, right? And that escalator can go up to 5% of the property value every year. And if they continue not to use them, they can actually condemn the property and take it by eminent domain. So, and there's other places that are getting kind of, better at that. But once again, if you don't have eyes on your land holdings and your properties, how do you know what's going on? And how do you actually form any kind of response? And you can't decide that because investors could use that information to their advantage, that we should hide it. Believe me, investors have 100 ways of getting this information. And this Who Owns America database that we were able to, we invested about $2 million putting together, right? Investors had access to that a long time ago because they're willing to pay $250,000 a year to, First American CoreLogic to get that data themselves, right? But it was prohibitively expensive for us, but for them, it's just a cost of doing business, right? So I don't know, you get to be really careful to, worry too much about getting the wrong information out there because, nefarious actors are going to act, because sometimes you can do more good with the information out there than the bad that's going to happen, right?
Mac, I appreciate the response and certainly the balance that they're giving voice to. There was a reference to ACI having been focused in 18 states. I wonder if someone could rattle those off for us. There was an interested party.
RJ, you're
RJ,
muted.
you're muted.
Yeah. No, you're still muted.
Sorry. I dropped the link in the chat for that one, but it's Washington, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. And we're looking at adding a handful of new communities in the second half of 2026.
Fantastic. RJ, thanks for that. And thanks also for the link. Much appreciated. There's a question here that perhaps is slightly beyond the scope, right, of much of this conversation, which is focused in scattered sites, single family. The question is, has anyone researched how Fannie and Freddie conventional, that is non-affordable multifamily finance programs, have fueled the expansion and consolidation of corporate ownership of rental properties and manufactured housing across the country?
So this is where I got started in this work, right? Because right now, the Lincoln Institute, we host a network called the Innovations in Manufactured Homes. It's a national network of people working in the mobile home space. And one of the things that we've been tracking, I've been tracking since 2015, is the investor purchases of manufactured housing parks or mobile home communities, right? And as it turns out, this started for one reason or another in 2015, and it has been going apace. And right now, about 30% of all the home sites in manufactured housing communities in the United States are owned by investors, either private equity or REITs, right? Real estate investment trusts. And one of the reasons that they wanted to do that is, number one, they're cash cows, these manufactured housing communities, right? And if you're looking at cap rates, which is an indication of how regular the cash flows are that you can get from any kind of rental property, in real estate investment, the lowest cap rates are in manufactured housing communities, and that sometimes is confusing. It's a little counterintuitive, but as it turns out, when you understand that, if you live in a manufactured housing community and you're renting the land under the home that you own or the home that you rent, right? You don't have a lot of other options in the housing market, and you're going to pay your rent on time because you don't want to be kicked out, right? And so their repayment or their on-time payment of their rents are like 97% in these parks, right? And then what even makes it worse is that when these investors come in, like Haven Park or some of the big, Hometown USA, come in and buy these parks, the first thing they do is they cut services and raise rents. And so one of the things that practitioners and organizers are doing at the state level in all these states is trying to find ways to impede the invasion of capital into that space, and to try to find ways to convert these mobile home communities, the manufactured housing communities, to resident ownership by organizing the residents to buy the parks themselves and run them as cooperatives, right? And if you don't know, Rock USA, which is kind of the main practitioner in this space, has now been able to convert about 357 of these communities from investor ownership to resident ownership. And that represents somewhere close to, I think, 30,000 units right now. Now, 30,000 units might sound like a lot. There's 50,000 parks in the United States, and there's about somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million units in all those parks, right? which is is sometimes surprising to people. They don't know just how large the manufactured housing sector is as part of the housing stock, right? Because it's invisible to most people, right? But anyway, so yes, and the answer to the Fannie and Freddie thing. Sorry for the long sermon here, but so Fannie and Freddie have been providing capital to investors to buy manufactured housing communities at discount rates since 2015, or even before that, probably, right? And they've been using it as a way to get credit for their duty to serve requirements, right? Because one of their duty to serve markets that they're required to serve is the manufactured housing space, right? And what's ironic is, so they've sent billions of dollars into the hands of REITs and private equity investors buying up these parks, right? And they've only been able to finance 2 resident-owned communities in that whole time. So they've provided financing for hundreds of parks to be owned by investors, but only 2 for resident ownership. And you know why? Because their underwriting requirements are so stringent that the resident ownership doesn't qualify. They don't meet the debt to income ratios. They don't meet the debt coverage ratios, and they don't meet the loan to value ratios that they establish, which is just dumb. Because if you look at the lending record of Rock USA with their 357 parks over the last 30 or so years, they've never had a single default. And they don't meet any one of those underwriting criteria that Fannie and Freddie impose on anybody else that wants to get their capital. And they have to get more expensive capital than Fannie and Freddie will provide because they can't get it from Fannie and Freddie, right? All right, sermon ended.
Mac, thank you for that. The last question here, if someone could tackle real briefly, was a curiosity if there were a corporate ownership map for some of the smaller communities to view. And I guess I would add to that, if not, is that something that Lincoln Institute is working towards?
I guess that's you, Reina.
Yeah. So we do have like we basically run our parcels nationally, so we do have the ability to create those maps for other locations in the country. With what we do is we work with partners on a project by project basis. So if folks want to reach out to figure out just so we can learn more about what they're looking for and help them with outlining the project, we're more than happy to do that. And I think our contact information is in the PowerPoint slides, which will be shared later. So happy to talk more then.
Fantastic. With that, Raquel, Jenny, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Yes, thank you for that. I know we got 4 minutes, but let me just put this out there as one last question. I think it ties into a question we got, or a comment from Ricardo Bird here, which talks about no mention of high renovation or maintenance costs. I'm taking that comment and working it into a question that I had, which is we're seeing that, some of the institutional investors are, selling off and doing first look sort of programs for nonprofits, and to the extent that home buyers can also participate in that. I guess this is a question for you, Mac. Do you feel that this is sort of a reset of capital that they'll continue to purchase in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of properties? And does it go to this question of, the renovation costs are increasing or maintenance costs are increasing now over time?
So, I don't know. The answer is I'm not quite sure, but one of the things I do know is that so in that Homes for the Future program that they're running at Grounded Solutions Network, they're working with that first look program, and they bought an inventory of properties, I know, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, right? And what I do know about these investors is that they treat their investment portfolio as a portfolio, right? And so they manage a portfolio. They might trade some properties in, and they sell some properties out, and they're doing it based on a bunch of different concerns, whether or not maybe they don't have a large enough concentration in the place that they're going to sell off, and they're going to move their capital to a place where they have a higher concentration, whatever, right? And it's only the more, I don't know, socially minded of them that actually give that first look kind of program. But one of the things that's really also useful to point out in this is that investor owners are not monolithic, right? There are some good ones, right? And the good ones are like Invitation Homes, which was when they finally get their feet under them, they decided that they're in a long-term holding strategy, and they were going to maintain the quality of their homes. But then there's these bottom feeders. And one of the things that Reina did was she mapped out all the largest investors and where their properties are. And we could get a very good idea of the people who are really concentrating on those very low income minority census tracts. And they tend to be the folks that aren't necessarily going to invest in high quality housing. They're just trying to cash flow as long as they can and amortize it away or just dump it on the market, right? So you got to be really careful what you're buying. And one of the things that Grounded Solutions was doing is a lot of really careful due diligence on that first look program to make sure they weren't being hoodwinked into just buying, an amortized stock that is no longer of value to the investor, right?
Thank you so much for that. I knew I was pushing up against time to ask it, so thank you. What a just fantastic conversation. Lots to take away, and of course, I've included the link to our website where we archive your presentation and this recording. But before we go, definitely want to bring back my colleague Jenny Brown to provide us with some of NCST's policy insights on regulatory or legislative policy work this.
Thanks, Raquel. Yes, and I realizing that time just really quickly, the biggest piece of legislation and news that we're really keeping our eyes on is the Housing for the 21st Century Act. This passed through the House with a bipartisan vote of 390 to 9, and so we're really looking at this just because it hits on a lot of different supply side focuses, and it's aimed to slash red tape and help kind of streamline things down the road for a lot of the programs that we are very much invested into, including the Home Investment Partnership Program and also CDBG. And so the way the legislation is kind of moving right now, the Senate is expected to consider its version of their housing package, which is the Road to Housing Act, later this month. And so we're thinking there's going to be negotiations for a final version that kind of marries all of these components together. And so we are definitely brainstorming kind of what our ideal package would look like, just having all of those components considered. And we're also keeping an eye on all of the action and executive movement that's coming out of the White House, just with the priority being on institutional investors, and also on first look policies that we at NCST are very much focused and invested into. Happy to answer also any questions off the line, Raquel.
Thank you, Jenny, and certainly we want to just continue to encourage anyone here to reach out to us, any one of our partners here. With that, we would like to conclude our community impact briefing for this month. Please be ready to look out for our March community impact briefing in the next couple weeks. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.